And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great today to have back on the podcast Dr. Andrew Walker. Dr. Walker, how are you doing today?
Hey, Josh, I'm doing really well, man. Thanks for having me back on the podcast.
And last time we had a chance to talk a little bit about religious liberty for all. I wrote a great book on that topic. Today I wanted to dive in and talk about a book that he wrote with his wife, Christian, about what do I say when? How do we talk to our kids about some of the toughest issues in culture? It's such a hands-on resource. And I tell you, Dr. Walker, I was at a church in Iowa this last week, and I saw a copy of God in the Transgender Debate, which was,
that's great.
in my perspective, like one of the first very practical guides for church leaders. And at the time, many were, well, why do we have to talk about this? And then, and it was so great to have that. And I consider this book just another book in that vein, so helpful. And so I want to talk about that, but then we also want to talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges for biblical Christians under a Trump presidency. We'll get to that towards the end. So looking forward to it. For any listeners that are not familiar with Dr. Walker, he serves as Associate Dean in the School of Theology, Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Public Theology at Southern. We just recently had Dr. Al Mohler from the same place, so there are a lot of great things going on there. Also the Director of Carl F.H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. And then in his spare time, works for Ethics and Public Policy Center as a fellow there and serves as the managing editor of World Opinions. You may have caught Dr. Walker was tapped by CNN during the election cycle to explain this very strange creature called the evangelical Christian and what in the world do they believe? And so, Dr. Walker, thank you for all that you're doing. I might just ask, any recent highlight or success story from your work?
You know, I just had a student approach me after our class today. It was the last class of the semester, and disclosed to me that some of the issues that I had talked about in class pertaining to having children had really kind of changed his philosophy on when they thought they might want to bring children into this world. And that just meant a lot to me because when you teach, you know, it's oftentimes that you're just communicating these ideas and you wonder, are these ideas having real world impact in the lives of your students? And so it was just very meaningful to me. And a reminder to anyone listening, you know, your professors and your teachers, wherever you have an educator in your life, they need encouragement just as much as they encourage you. So it was a really meaningful interaction. Thanks for asking that.
Well, and that's a great reminder to us to be thankful for those that pour into our lives. Sometimes we just say thanks and move on. But also, I'm so grateful having had the opportunity to come and see a class. I often hear from pastors on, I did some of the things in seminary, very helpful, learning those original languages, but how to run what is essentially a large, small business, a church. How do I think through public theology? And I think that's one of the distinctives there at your institution. And it was so much fun to just sit there, listen, not just to those students from the United States, but even around the world as they were processing that. So so grateful for where God has placed you. So pivoting to this new book, What Do I Say When? What led you and Christian to write the book?
Sure. So I speak really all over the nation on a lot of really controversial issues, and it never fails that one of the first or second questions I get is, you know, the content you're teaching is wonderful. How do we translate this into age appropriate ways for our children? Because we need to have these conversations with our children with great urgency. And, you know, I have some general answers on how to think through those, but that's not my area of specialty in terms of putting that on the lowest possible shelf. But it just so happens I'm married to someone who is really good at that. My wife is an elementary school teacher at our local classical Christian school and has run a kids ministry and has written a lot of curriculum for Lifeway and the Gospel Project. And so we thought, why not bring our respective gifts in the ways that we've been equipped to equip parents? And so, you know, we're really clear. The goal of this book is it's not a parenting book because we're not parenting experts ourselves. We're still figuring out what it means to be parents in this particular culture. what we are doing is trying to write a book for parents, because we're on this journey too. Our oldest is almost 14. Our youngest just turned 6. And so, in some sense, our children were, they kind of test drove the book, so to speak.
Okay.
And so I feel like we've had some success in helping our children think proactively about these issues. And so we just thought, let's do this for a general population. And so we wrote this book. It's 10 topics that are some of the most culturally divisive topics for Christians in this culture, and it's full of biblical content. But then every chapter has a section of each chapter dedicated to what we call the floors, kind of corresponding to the floors in a home.
Yeah.
And so basically trying to equip parents in age-appropriate ways from these various floors. The first floor is like age 4 to 8. Second floor is 8 to 12. Third floor is 12 to 16, kind of preparing to launch those children out into the world. And so we've tried to make something that is accessible, but also deeply biblical. And the most challenging thing for me, Josh, was to try to distill the most important principles of each issue down to like 5 or 7 teaching principles. Because if you talk to an academic, we never have enough time, we never have enough space to explain ourselves fully. And so it was a really good exercise for me to concretize or to be concise on these issues. And it's actually informed my teaching in my own ethics classes today to make it more digestible.
So I love the beautiful picture of a Christian marriage here, how you and your wife just come together and your differing skill sets just complemented each other to make this possible. I will not say this is what happened in your home. I will say, because I'm an attorney and my wife is a teacher as well, that there's often a lot of, this 4th grader does not know what natural law theory is. So you've got to figure out how to explain this in their world. So
yeah, well, and that was one of the fun things. One of my narrow area of like academic focus is on natural law theory, and I got to promote my own other book. So if you're interested in natural law theory, had a book come out in May called Faithful Reason, which is kind of an evangelical primer on natural law theory. But I nowhere in the book do the terms natural law come into view, but it absolutely informs why we wrote what we wrote and how we wrote what we wrote. Because central to my teaching ministry and my writing ministry is this notion that Christian truth claims are not just Christian truth claims. They're truth claims, period. That Christian morality is morality. And so if Christians can get a grasp on the nature of the human body, a human body given to us by God, but a human body that we can understand through biology, through philosophy, all of a sudden, the Christian is equipped with a much more robust understanding of how to engage the public square. And that really speaks to one of the reasons we wrote this book is it's defensive simply because we live in a culture that is assaulting Christian truth claims. Mm. But this book is meant to be an offensive tool because we want to give parents the courage and the confidence to know that, we actually have better answers than secularism does or that progressivism does. And so let's go on offense and make the world prove its claims because, as one of my friends likes to say on the subject of the transgender controversy, we're not the weird ones for believing that males and females are discrete categories. The world is the weird one for believing that men can simply become women based on how they want to identify or what clothes they want to wear. And so I see this book as really just a defense of reality. And if reality is ours, it doesn't belong to secularism or progressivism.
That's good. I enjoyed talking with Dr. Moeller just briefly. As he mentioned, he was having to wade through strollers into chapel at Southern.
That's
Is
right.
that the biblical sexual ethic has often been seen as well? That's a problem for us, whereas I think it may actually be one of our greatest apologetics moving forward. And I also just so appreciate that the you and Christian are in this right now, and I think that's what makes the book so helpful to parents. We have kids in the same age ranges, experiencing things that even maybe 5 to 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. So it's such a great resource. We'll link to the book, but also to your other work in the show notes as well. So we don't have a ton of time today, but I wanted to dive into maybe just a few of these so listeners can get a taste of what they'll find in the full book. So what advice do you have for talking to their kids about gender and sexuality? So we're just going to dive right into the deep end.
Yeah.
This isn't controversial at all, but what advice do you have there?
Sure. So, I mean, if you're thinking about this at the first floor level, I mean, all you're wanting to establish with a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old is there's a difference between males and females, that our bodies are different. And the beauty of the Christian worldview is that it's actually a very simple worldview. And it's ideology and sin that wants to complexify what are otherwise very common sense principles based in reality, biology, and philosophy. So just establish the fact that males and females and boys or girls are different. And a 6-year-old girl is pretty clear that boys are different, even at 6. As you start thinking about the second floor from age 8 to 12, then you're beginning to understand that, or the child is beginning to understand that, males and females are moms and dads, and that moms and dads are not categories that we can just kind of easily dismiss, or we can't just, they're not interchangeable. The idea that men are fathers, men are husbands, men are fathers, women are wives, they become mothers. And so really without talking about these concepts like complementarianism or complementarity, we're beginning to establish these ideas that males and females are not just different, we're different in the unique gifts and aptitudes that the Lord has made us for. That, again, moms and dads are not interchangeable. And then probably, around 8 to 12, you might be having those initial, and you probably should be having those initial birds and bees conversations. The question of where do babies come from? That's probably that 8 to 12 age gap where that question is going to surface and where it needs to be addressed. So then, obviously, you have that conversation, explain all of that, rooted in a bodily reality. And then if you're thinking about this from the 12 to the 16-year-old age gap, what you're really wanting to do then is to dig deeper and to explore what are those differences between males and females? What is the relationship between our body and our sense of maleness and femaleness? Understanding why something like same-sex marriage is actually not marriage, and it's not a marriage because the bodies between two homosexuals, whether male or female, cannot come together in a comprehensive union to bring forth children. And so marriage is a distinct type of relationship compared to all other types of relationships, because only something that can come from a husband and a wife, namely children, can be experienced within the context of a marriage. And so you'll notice all three of those levels of development, we're hitting on categories of creation order, ontology, complementarianism, our design, our embodiment, but I'm not deploying all of those heavy terms. You're putting those in more simplified categories, and the complexity is kind of growing the older that the child gets, and for as far as their understanding is concerned.
I so appreciate that. And it struck me as I still teach students some at my home church, and we just went through the first 3 chapters of Genesis. I thought this would be a quick 2-week, 3-week thing, and a couple months later we finished up. And I remember just reading through Genesis 1:26 and 27, male and female created he them. And a student raised their hand, this is completely unprompted, like, oh, so, Pastor Josh, like, so non-binary isn't a thing, is it? Like, and it was just the scriptures. I mean, it was just the created order speaking to them. It was the Holy Spirit. And
Right.
like you said, it's not complex if you're just explaining the beauty and power of God's created order. So
Yep.
the other element of this that I so appreciate, Andrew, and you were one of the first, I think in our generation to write the books on marriage when it wasn't all that popular, and just saying, hey, this isn't something we should be defensive about. We should be offensive about as well,
Yeah.
to show the goodness of it. So that's very helpful on sex and gender. What about abortion? Certainly, non-controversial as well. How did you think through that?
Yeah. So, it all began for us, that issue in particular, a couple of years ago in Kentucky. We had a referendum on whether or not abortion would be a constitutional right or not. And yard signs were popping up in neighborhoods. And our daughter, who just turned 10, was 8 at the time, and she was noticing these yard signs and was asking us questions about what these yard signs were about. And so no one wants to bring up abortion to an 8-year-old child. And it's a graphic, gruesome reality. And so we said to our middle child, well, there are people in this world who think that a baby in a mommy's belly is not fully a person or really a person, and that child in the womb can have their life taken from them. And the beauty of the innocent 8-year-old child's mind is that I didn't have to engage in any complex philosophical argument, because the 8-year-old immediately understands, well, why would a mommy and daddy not want their baby? Like that, babies belong to mommies and daddies. They're meant to be cared for. Abortion seems completely opposite of what moms and dads are here for. And we just walked through basic categories like that, telling her that we disagree with individuals who are okay with abortion. We reminded to her that her mom and dad never, ever, ever would have considered abortion for her, because we think that all children are loved by God and created by God. So we wanted to take that as an opportunity to affirm our love for our daughter. And then we talked about, how do we disagree with people who think differently than us? And that's where, this idea that human beings are made in God's image, and we can have, sincere, really stern disagreements, but we still need to register those disagreements in a responsible, respectful way. And, lo and behold, she went on about her day, and everything was fine. And all of a sudden we were able to communicate to her a pretty firm, dignity ethic. And to this point, to this day, I mean, it's one of those things that's carried over. And we once saw a very profoundly disabled boy as we were leaving a restaurant one day. And I noticed the boy, he kind of caught my younger two's attention. And as we were leaving the restaurant, I said to my youngest two, who would have been, I guess at this time, 9 and 5, I said, hey, I noticed you saw that young boy in a wheelchair. What did you notice about that boy? And they said, well, he obviously needs a lot of care from his mom and dad, and it's very sad. And I said, well, how do you think we should treat that boy? How do you think God views that boy? And they just said, matter of factly, like it wasn't even a real complex thought whatsoever. Well, God made that boy. His parents love him. And so, we need to be kind and loving to that boy. And I was just like, there it is. That's a full-orbed dignity ethic that our 5-year-old and our 9-year-old fully comprehend, and can carry forth from that day forward. And so one of the things I want to say to parents is, I understand the instinct to want to shelter your kids from these hard conversations. My instinct is to run towards those conversations, even if they may be a little difficult, and a little bit awkward because, what we're adamant about in the book is you have to catechize your children first, or else the world will catechize your children for you. One of the most important principles we lay down in the book. And so we just want to encourage parents to have those conversations. But to have those conversations, they need resources, which is why we wrote this book.
Something that strikes me in the New Testament, there's this phrase about how Jesus kind of taught his disciples, and there are the sermons, but then it just says that he taught them on the way or in the way. And just as I've been hearing you share these anecdotes, it's like, well, you may be trying to shelter your daughter, but then here comes an abortion yard sign in your neighbor's yard, or perhaps you don't have technology in the house, but they're going to see YouTube or maybe TikTok on a friend's phone. There's just no way to avoid these things altogether.
Well,
and you just took out those opportunities to teach.
Yeah, and that speaks to what we kind of envision for this resource. We're not expecting this to be a resource where the parent reads the chapter and then sits down and has a prolonged lecture and discussion with the child. What we envision is that, and I love that imagery that, Jesus was teaching them as they were going, teaching them on the way. It was kind of in process, in flux. And so that's what we view this book as, is parents need to do some study, and they need to be able to ask the right questions. And here's the thing, the questions are going to present themselves naturally because we live in this culture. So just be ready for them, and be discipling your kids every single moment of every single day. Discipleship is, it's not a program, although it can be in the local church setting. It's a lifestyle. It's a habit that we are doing 24/7.
So good. And I love how even in that abortion context, you could just focus in on that, but you're also teaching them civility in the context of relationship with others in a society where we disagree with one another. So, listener, you've gotten just a taste of two of those topics, and the Walkers walk through a number of others, including technology, etc. So I want to recommend that you pick that up. So for just sake of time, I wanted to pivot. You recently joined a couple of co-hosts to launch a great podcast called The Bully Pulpit, meaning that you have the opportunity from the pulpit to present what is true, good, and beautiful, and been very engaging. So I encourage folks to take a listen there. But one of the topics you've been discussing recently is what are some of the challenges, but also the opportunities in a Trump presidency. So as you're looking at the next couple of years, any just advice or thoughts for listeners? How should they pray? How should they engage?
Sure. Yeah, no, there's tons of opportunities with a second Trump administration. There are also some challenges. Let me walk through the challenges first. I think the first challenge is, tragically, in this campaign, the Trump administration kind of made some waffling comments about their commitment to the unborn. So, we are right now at a deficit culturally in the pro-life movement, and political parties want to win, and they want to pivot to issues that can win elections on. And so I understand that calculation, even though I don't think that they should have pivoted like they did. But here's what I would say, though, at the same time. I don't know if Donald Trump has a real core conviction on the life issue, which means he's actually quite malleable on the subject. And when you think about, originally he made some statements coming out in support of Amendment 4, Florida's abortion referendum that was on the ballot on November. And a lot of evangelicals nationally criticized the president. And the very next day he walked that back. He realized that he wasn't fully apprised of the problems of that, and he kind of corrected the error. And so it's a discouraging moment on the life issue in the Republican Party and in the Trump administration. But it's not abandon all hope, because the Republican Party is still stacked with pro-life advocacy. As I have been critical of some of the Trump administration's pivot, I also think there has been some hand-wringing and too much defeatism from evangelicals, thinking that this issue is just completely lost. It's not completely lost. So we got to keep making the argument. Another threat, or a difficulty, I should say, is if they're not a super socially conservative administration, but yet a lot of evangelicals will have voted for Donald Trump, and I voted for Donald Trump, and I'm not bashful or embarrassed by that. It means that there has to be a willingness to make some respectful criticisms at times, and it's not fun to criticize the home team, right? You want to be criticizing those who are your total political enemies. Well, Donald Trump's not my total political enemy, but he does get some things wrong. So it's going to be difficult for a lot of Christians because we're going to need to speak up at times if the administration makes some misstatements and some miscalibrations on this issue. But at the same time, here's an opportunity. There are tons of ways the Trump administration, even if they're not a super socially conservative administration, they're going to be staffed by a lot of social conservatives who will be making good policies. So I recently put out a tweet on 20 things that the Trump administration could do to benefit social conservatives. I won't read off all 20. If you want to see those on my Twitter account or my X account is Andrew T. Walk. But Josh, just a couple of them to give a flavor of what could be done. They could cut off federal funding for Planned Parenthood. They could implement the Mexico City policy that cuts off federal funding for foreign NGOs that provide or refer for abortions. They can emphasize parental rights in education. They can fight for school choice. They can fight to remove DEI in public education. They can oppose gender ideology. They can oppose the Equality Act. They can oppose males competing against females in sports. And there are more things I could say. I don't want to read all 20 right now, but there are a lot of things that I am very confident the Trump administration will do because when you are voting for the president, you're not just voting for a president, you're voting for personnel, and personnel is policy. And listen, I know that I'm going to have friends in high up places that are very pro-life and that are very Christian. They're going to be a part of this administration. And even though this administration is not going to be perfect on all of our issues, I can guarantee you they will be way more favorable to our concerns than the opposite ticket would have been. So, Donald Trump, the current Republican Party, doesn't share all of my values, but they don't hate all of my values. And so we should take that wiggle room that we have and try to get some wins. And I think we will get some wins out of this, actually.
Well, I'm so encouraged by that. And I do think it's, as I've told folks, this is not a resolution, but it's an opportunity for us to engage. And I take from what happened an encouragement that there is a view of the American future where perhaps the created order we have a recommitment to that created order and to religious freedom and to the family. And I think this election signaled that a lot of folks are seeing that. Like that's a hollow future if we don't get back to these things. So
yeah, and Josh, let me just speak to that real quick. I'm actually super encouraged right now about the fact that the left seems to be reconsidering some of its commitment to transgenderism. I find it very fascinating, the difference in how males and females voted. And in fact, more females voted for the Republican administration than was anticipated, which is encouraging. But also the ways in which males voted for this ticket, because they recognize there's something about the Republican ticket right now that is more favorable to male nature and male inclination than you see in the Democratic Party. And so I think that this is, there is a renaissance of creation order realities bearing down on our nation. And I think that is reflected in the outcome of this election in some sense, because, as I like to say in my classes, the natural law finds a way. God's created order finds a way to reassert itself. And we will end up honoring that creational design in ways we may not have anticipated, or we will continue to disregard those creational patterns and we'll just go off the rails culturally. And this election cycle, I think, was a vindication that even non-Christians are picking up on the fact that some of the gender lunacy going on in our society has gone too far. So let's take what little wind we have at our backs and try to move the ball forward.
Amen. So it is an exciting time, and that's why I was so excited to have you back on at this moment. And in a sense, we want to teach our own children, catechize them, but also work for a world where that created order brings flourishing. And so I thought it was great to just pull those two things together. So, Dr. Walker, thank you for your time. And we'll definitely link to the books and also to your X account. Enjoy following you there as well. So thanks so much for taking time to join us today.
Yeah, Josh, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.